started. So hello everyone, I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's free event hosted by the Windsor, Essex County Atheist Society. We are a group of over 375 members from the community. We're mainly a group of students, but we also have a large number of people from the community who join us on a regular basis. The purpose of our group is to raise awareness in the community about secular issues, educate ourselves in the community about theism and non-theism, engage in philosophical discussions, create a network for non-believers, and foster communication with groups of both similar and dissimilar views. We hold a variety of events such as movie nights, monthly meetings, fundraisers, and blood drives. Last year, as many of you remember, we held a debate between Reverend Joe Boot and Dan Barker. It actually is posted on our YouTube channel if you missed it, and we have over 16,000 views at the present time. So if you're excited to be here tonight, that's great. And we also would appreciate donations to our club. That would be a great help because we'd love to host events like this in the future. I'd like to take a moment and also thank our sponsors, Windsor Humanist Society. So thank you to Windsor Humanist Society. And the University of Windsor Students Alliance. Many thanks go out to my fellow club executives for helping work together to make this night possible as well. So thank you guys. Just to note, if you want to pop by our table after the event, we have t-shirts for sale, brochures, pins, and so on, so feel free to stop by, and if you'd like to join our mailing list as well, you're more than welcome to. So, we are brought together today to hear the powerful story of Nate Phelps. So Nate Phelps is here to share his story that entails his journey. As many of you know, Nate Phelps grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church. His father is Pastor Fred Phelps, and his sister is Shirley Phelps-Roper. The Westboro Baptist Church is known to be one of the most controversial groups in the United States. They frequently protest military funerals, often including young children in their protests. The messages of the Westboro Baptist Church have targeted a number of groups, but in particular, their hurtful messages of intolerance are often directed towards members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. They even protested at the funeral of Matthew Shepard, a young man who was reportedly targeted by two men for being gay. Matthew Shepard was tortured and murdered, and Westboro Baptist Church attended his funeral with signs bearing homophobic slogans. Nate Phelps has kindly agreed to a question and answer period after his presentation, so thank you for that. And we'll have instructions about the Q&A period after his presentation. I'd like to mention that Nate Phelps is now a speaker and author on child abuse and an advocate for the LGBT community. He's also an atheist and executive director of Center for Inquiry Calgary. If you have read about Nate Phelps, I am sure that you would agree his story is inspirational and shows his resilience. I present to you Nate Phelps.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Can you hear okay as far from the mic? Everybody hear all right? Good. Well, I wasn't expecting to be staying in a casino. That's why I was there, by the way. How many folks are familiar with the Bible? A lot of you grew up in religious homes, I assume. 66 books in the Bible. Starts with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and the Revelation. When I was 7 years old, my father got tired of waiting for the kids to find the passages he was preaching from, so he required us to learn the books of the Bible. Afterwards, if we were slow in getting to the passage he was preaching from. He'd pause in his preaching, cast a gimlet eye on the offending child, and demand somebody smack that kid. That gives you a brief summary of the environment we grew up in. Back in 1991, my family, well, it was the Westboro Baptist Church, but it effectively was 9 of my siblings and my father and their extended family members. We gathered at the corner of 10th and Gage in Topeka, Kansas to protest the fact that there were gays gathering at that park. That was a meeting place for the park there, for the gays at the Gage Park there. And it wasn't so much, the community wasn't so much offended by the idea that they were going to try to change that circumstance, but they were offended by the signs and the attitude that was reflected both in the signs and the way my family was presenting them. So it turned into a bit of a local fight. The signs got a little uglier. My father started a campaign with the fax, where he was sending daily or twice a day faxes out to government officials and other members of the community. Actually, as an aside, years later, my older brother Mark, who also left, was applying for an insurance policy, and he was, during the process, they had determined that he was a higher risk. So his agent, trying to get that decision overturned so he could pay lower premiums, actually presented a handful of those faxes as justification for why my brother was on antidepressants. And so they made the decision to lower his premiums after they saw the faxes. So that gives you an idea of the nature of the language and the message that came out in those faxes. So subsequent to that, as was mentioned, my father deciding to protest at the funeral. This was a novel idea at that point. Protest at the funeral of Matthew Shepard. Of course, it was an international media event, and he got a lot of attention from that. And then things died down a little bit until after war in Iraq and Afghanistan started, and then they came up with the idea of protesting the funerals of soldiers. And suddenly, America was offended. So it didn't take long from them, it being a local situation where they were harassing their neighbors, which they had been doing the entire time that I had been growing up there as well, to suddenly becoming a national test case on the limits of free speech. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Schneider versus Phelps, so you've heard that there was a Supreme Court decision basically ruling in favor of my family and their protests, calling it a free speech issue. To them, nothing was sacred. No one was immune. They were at the funerals of victims of Hurricane Katrina, several nationally televised shootings. They show up every year at the Academy Awards. I think they were there this year again. And actor Paul Walker, of course, recently passed away, and they made much of that. So where there's a national wound, you'll find the salt of the Westboro Baptist Church. And their message, God hates everyone and everything in America, in Canada, in the world. And the basic reason for this is because of their attitude, or America's attitude about moving in the direction of giving equal rights to the LGBT community. They recently, or in the recent past, protested at the funeral, or announced they were going to protest at the funeral of Steve Jobs after he passed away, founder of Apple. And the reason for protesting his funeral was because he had a international platform to preach the message of God, and he failed to do so. But the irony was missed on that they were presenting that plan to protest using their iPhones and their iPads. I also noticed a few years back that on the front page of one of the websites for the Ku Klux Klan, they actually had a disclaimer saying they were not involved with and do not agree with the tactics and the belief system of the Westboro Baptist Church. They actually got turned down by the Ku Klux Klan as well. From my perspective, it was inevitable. My father's theological message was fed to us from infancy, literally from infancy. First time we got home, first Sunday we were home from the hospital, we were sitting in the pulpit or in the pews at the Westboro Baptist Church listening to our Father preach twice every Sunday. It was interesting to watch this video tonight because you got to see my brother Fred and his wife Betty, and there was a nervousness. I don't know how many of you noticed that. There was a tension there, and Louis did a good job of trying to kind of suss that out because he noticed it as well. The issue that what I observed watching that was not so much the words that they were saying, but I know why they were not willing to be a little bit more forthcoming with Louis on tape, because every minute, every word that came out of their mouths was going to be carefully reviewed and considered by the other members of that church. And they would hear about it for the weeks and months to come if they had expressed anything or even suggested an unwillingness to stand firm with the message of the Westboro Baptist Church. And that is a key component of that whole process, that whole system there. You are not allowed to think for yourself. So I talked about the environment that we grew up in. There were verses, there were a lot of books that were around the house that we read. I remember one book, it was a larger book for younger children, which was very interesting because one of the pages, the full spread on both sides of the page, was this giant painting of the Great Flood and people's bodies lying across the few exposed rocks that were left, and Noah standing at the helm of the ark, and a young woman frantically clinging to the edge of the ark, and she's holding up her infant, begging for Noah to take the child on board, and he's ignoring her. And then there was a painted sign, sat in the vestibule of the church for years. I don't know what the original intent of the sign was, but it had a corner broken off, so I think they had taken it down at some point before I came of age. The sign had a verse from Hebrews painted on it that said, "It's appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment." One of the first cogent memories that I have growing up there was my father was constantly preaching about hell and eternity and the conditions that you would spend in hell. The worm that eats on you never dies, that kind of language. And I had kind of, as I tended to do when I got older, I would kind of go off in my own world and imagine things when my father was preaching. And this particular time I decided I was going to try to get my mind around this idea of eternity, because it's not a concept that we grasp easily. And so I sat there and I tried to imagine eternity, and then his language that, as far as you can think, is literally a drop in the bucket, and then you have another drop, and pretty soon it's just so frightening, so terrifying to me that I burst into tears trying to imagine that concept, the enormity of that concept. This was probably the first time that I can remember that the evidence of what my father was doing to the people in that church came clear to me. My father is a self-styled primitive Baptist. He follows the teachings of John Calvin. They're called the Tulip Doctrines. And at the heart of all those doctrines is this concept of absolute predestination. And absolute predestination is at odds with all of the other Protestant branches of faith, in that it teaches that God in the council halls of eternity past decided who would be saved and who would be cast into hell for eternity. And so the vast majority of the people on earth who have been born on earth and who will be born on earth will be cast into hell, and only a small remnant would be saved. And the decision, this is the important part, folks, the decision is God's. It's not our decision. Most folks who have been exposed to the Christian faith understand the message that if you accept Christ into your heart and you say the right words and you pray the right prayer, that you will be saved and you will go to heaven. My father says that's not possible because we're all dead in our trespasses and sins. So Christ, or God, decides who's going to go to hell, who's going to go to heaven, and then we live the consequences of that decision. We have no control over it. If he saves you, somehow, if you weren't born in the Westboro Baptist Church, you will miraculously find your way there. Because he believes that is the only place on earth today where God's elect can be found. He literally believes that the rest of us are all going to hell. And that small group is going to be saved. Before I go on with my prepared speech, I was on the phone this week with a reporter from the Topeka Capital Journal because there's some evidence that my father's health is failing. So they're preparing the articles that they'll write when that finally happens. And one of the points I stressed with him was this idea that started when I was growing up there, and I've heard evidence from conversations that are in the media and things that my siblings have written that it has grown and developed to the point where they now believe that none of them are going to die, that Christ will return before any of them feel the sting of death. So they really honestly believe they're living in end times, and so they're kind of dealing with this end game scenario. But the reality is, my father's going to pass away. So that'll be an interesting situation when that does happen, to see exactly how that plays out with the rest of the people in that church. Anyway, so back to the lessons we were taught. My father, first of all, said that the King James Bible was the only Bible that was legitimate. And if any of you have any understanding of the background of the history of the Bible, the various versions that have come out over the years, will realize pretty quickly that the King James Version came primarily from the Latin Vulgate, which is agreed by most biblical scholars to be one of the worst versions as far as the accuracy of it. Even when you factor in the idea that to call the Bible accurate is virtually impossible, because there are more errors when you take all of the primary source material and secondary source material. There are more errors in that material than there are words in the Bible. So the idea that there is any one source of absolute truth is almost comical, but he insisted that it was, not only is there one, but it is the King James Bible. And from that Bible, we learned that every thought and deed in our lives were laced with moral implications. We learned that every decision was a decision for or against the will of God. We learned that we weren't to be of the world, but separate from it. Look at the world and what it does, and assume it's evil. To keep us separated from the world, because that was one of the things that the Bible requires of us. My father, if he wasn't seeing enough of that going on in the environment, he would create the environment. And I recall when we were in grade school that when Christmas time came around, if the classroom was going to sing Christmas carols or do anything that might suggest some religious overtones, that they had to pause before they did it and send the Phelps kids to the library. Keep us separate from the world. When we misbehaved, our father would rage for hours that we were sons of Belial, that we were workers of iniquity and pawns of Satan. Everything we did was sinning against the Most High God. We learned early to do or say anything to hide the fact that we had made a mistake or we'd done something we weren't supposed to, because of those profound implications. We also learned from the Bible that our hearts were deceitful and desperately wicked, that we were inherently evil, and only God's work in our heart, if he chose to work in our heart, made us marginally acceptable. Our education about the world was profoundly colored by this fundamental message. One of my earliest doubts about his belief system was that if The Adamic race is so thoroughly cursed with this moral corruption, and how is it that we so willingly turn to the writings of these same corrupt men to find our salvation? My father's answer is that the Bible says these corrupt men were guided by the Holy Spirit when they penned their work. To that I would say what Louis said tonight in that second video. Well, it would, wouldn't it? From behind the pulpit, our father raged against every other belief system that was out there in the world. Sunday after Sunday, he would build up straw men and he would tear them down and convince us that even the most beloved Christian leaders at that time, Robert Schuller, Billy Graham, Pat Robertson, yeah, he was at one point. Even they were evil, but they were going to hell. I remember when the New York Times published the newspaper that said God is dead. We heard about that for months. One of the consequences of this practice that he engaged in, constantly looking out there in the world and finding every little thing and saying it was evil. And so one of the consequences for me was that you start to question your ability to discern the truth, the natural capacity that you have to look at a situation and to consider all the variables and to make a decision. You don't trust that anymore, because if you, somewhere in that process, come up with an idea that was contrary to what we were taught, then you start wondering, is there something wrong with my reasoning? Is there something wrong with me? Is Satan influencing my decisions, my thoughts? Another consequence that I didn't realize till years later when I was involved with more mainstream Christian community was that it was very difficult for me to really have a sense of what was right and wrong in the world. Because of that fact that you don't trust your own thoughts, number one, and number two, because you have these filters that don't reflect the reality of the world, and you're running all of your ideas and your thoughts through these filters, and you really can never feel confident that you really know what's going on out there in the world. Any violation of Fred's rules puts you at risk of violence, harassment, and being excommunicated and ostracized. Libby talked there about some of the experiences that she had. If you recall, she also talked about that her cousin Megan came to her and challenged her. Well, recently Megan and Grace left also, and they actually are attending a Jewish synagogue now, I understand, part of their exploration into the rest of the world. But they had done an interview, I think they were up here in Quebec, and they did an interview and ran a newspaper article. And some of the things that Megan said in there really speak to this idea of the harassment and the being excommunicated and ostracized. She said, over time we started to see things that made us think, wait a second, there's something wrong here. This doesn't fit. But questioning proved difficult due to the strict interpretation of Scripture by that Mr. Phelps, or Gramps, to Megan and Grace, insisted the Westboro Baptist Church members adhere to. It was always very much all or nothing. That's a crucial component of a cult-like environment. All or nothing, black and white, us versus them. She says the way the church presents it is there's the WBC and the rest of the world. The rest of the world is evil. The WBC is the only place in the world in our generation that's right. You guys, I'm not making this up. That led to a decision to leave the square 2-block section of Topeka where they all live. And Megan says, hurting my mom was the worst thing of all. Their family made it clear if they left it would be a clean break. They believe that they cannot care about anything but what God thinks. And they're so sure about what God thinks that there can be no other options. We were both terrified after leaving, Megan says. I was afraid we were going to hell. Many times when we were driving, I thought God was going to kill us. This is reality to those folks. This is reality to a lot of people who've left extreme religious organizations, fundamentalist organizations where the dogma is absolute. I remember not long after I left, I moved to Kansas City, was working for a lawyer there, and I'm walking downtown heading for work one day, and I can vividly recall looking up And a mad thing, pieces of the building falling down and landing on me. I'm wondering about the collateral damage that would cause innocent people around me. That's how obsessed I was with this idea that somehow God was going to get revenge. One thing that's not common knowledge is that actually all of my siblings down to 2 under me, so 7 of the oldest 8 left at some point early on. And all but 3 went back. And one of the main reasons they go back is because they leave with this idea that leaving, first of all, the church hands them a letter that says that they're delivered to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that their spirit might be saved in the day of the Lord. So this is kind of a curse on them. And this is very real to the people who've grown up in that environment. So they get out there in the real world, and then things happen. As all of you know, things happen. Bad things happen. But their process, their filter says that it happened because God's mad at them. So the only way to be safe and the only way to protect yourself from these bad things happening is to get back in God's good graces. So they went back home. So I mentioned violence, and Megan didn't touch on that, so let me spend a little bit of time with that. It was a fact of life in our home when I was growing up. As I reached the age of awareness, my father made the decision that he was going to go back to school and get his degree get his law degree. He had a lot of responsibilities. He had a wife, and I think at that point there were 10 of us kids born. And so the pressure that he was under, he ended up getting addicted to prescription amphetamines, and then to counter that, so he could get sleep, he started taking barbiturates. So when he would be hyped up on those drugs, his temper was very violent, very extreme, and it was very, it was unpredictable. It was the unpredictability that was probably part of the hardest part, the most difficult aspect of that environment that we grew up in. He would just suddenly freak out, and then it would last for hours, and he'd be screaming at everyone, he'd be throwing things. And then if it was focused on one of the kids, it could get pretty desperate and pretty ugly. Despite those circumstances, he managed to finally graduate from law school, did quite well, in fact. But within a couple of years, he had been suspended from practicing law at the state bar for ethical violations. And so that led us to a couple more important chapters of growing up in that environment. First thing he did was, because we didn't have the income, he figured that it would be a good idea to send his kids out to sell candy. And we were selling candy for the church to buy an organ. And then we were selling candy for the church to buy a piano. And then after a couple of years selling candy there in the Topeka area, folks were wondering why we hadn't bought that piano and organ yet. So then we started going out to surrounding cities. We were in Lawrence and Kansas City and Wichita, and ended up going up to Nebraska and Oklahoma and hit the big cities there. And one of the things we discovered fairly early on was that people like to spend money when they've been drinking. So Fridays, Saturday nights, you would find us in the bars in Kansas City peddling our chocolates for Jesus, and there would be a stripper right over here taking care of business. Now, I'm not complaining about the view, but as you can see, there's a disconnect there. There's this idea on the one hand that we are the only people on earth who are under God's protection and represent God on this earth. And this is what we're doing. This is what we're exposed to. And then we'd be in church on Sunday morning and be hearing how special and how important we were. So that created some questions for me. And then on the first anniversary of my father's suspension, we came home from school, and my mom's sitting in the vestibule of the church, and she's crying, and she's got the stocking cap on her head, and my older brother Mark is there with her, trying to comfort her. And she pulls the stocking cap off, and her hair has all been cut off. It's a butcher job. There's spots where you can see the scalp, and other spots where it's an inch or two long. So And she was pretty upset about it. She said that he'd cut her hair off because she wasn't in subjection to him. So at that point, clearly this is an act of violence, this is an act of abuse. But for me, I focused in on this passage that I'd been hearing my father preach about for, since I was born. Passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about women are to keep their hair long, and that they are to cover it in the presence of the Lord in the church. And my father had preached that the word there in the New Testament for long was actually translated uncut. So no woman in our church was supposed to have scissors touch their hair. And that was basically the first thing that he would look at when he ran into a woman in the environment, in the community, who wanted to challenge him. If she had short hair, then she obviously was going to hell. So that was a big issue with us. And the fact that he cut my mother's hair against her will sent the message that he had absolute control over her very salvation. So there were layers to my father's violence and abuse. My father taught that women were second-class citizens. He proclaimed this adamantly. There was no room for compromise. The Bible was clear on the subject. Eve had been deceived by a talking snake. So logically, she was the weaker vessel in all respects. I mean, that follows, doesn't it? I don't know, to me, that's laughable. And it always surprises me that folks, when they hear that, they don't just break out laughing but that speaks to the fact that we live in a culture that the idea that someone's born of a virgin, that these ideas that are put forth by Christianity, somehow they have some level of validity to them, even to those folks who don't believe it. If someone said that today, if I said today that a snake had talked to me, I would be on my way to the mental hospital. But somehow we let it pass. I was actually in O'Hare Airport back in September, coming back from a speaking engagement, and sitting watching a football game. And I believe it was the Atlanta Falcons. It was early on in the season, and this running back had done a pretty good job on the previous play. And all of a sudden, this guy is standing at my shoulder, and he's just blurting out how incredible that guy is. And he says, "You know why that happens, don't you?" And I kind of looked at him puzzled because I wasn't sure. I didn't really have a context yet. He said, "The reason that guy's such a good runner is because of Nimrod." And I knew then I was in trouble, because the Bible talks about Nimrod and how it was a great nation, and they were great warriors, and then they were defeated, and they were enslaved, and then they will rise up, and then they will finally be defeated once and for all. So what he was saying was that this black running back was successful today because this was the third stage in the cycle of the first being great warriors and then being enslaved, slaves, black Americans. And then they were going to rise up again. So that's why we have all these successful black athletes, because God ordained it in the Old Testament of the Bible. And it went downhill from there. Apologize and say goodbye to the gentleman. Anyway, back to the idea that women are second-class citizens. Paul, of course, bolsters this idea in several of his books in the New Testament and the early churches. And somewhere in there he says, "Wives, be in subjection to your husbands." And my father took from that, as do a lot of the fundamentalist Protestant faiths, to say that if the wives are not in subjection, that it's the duty of the husband to bring them back into subjection. And so that was his justification for beating my mother. But when my father turned his instructive fist on my mother, it seemed unnatural to me, inappropriate. Because you're looking at a man who's 250 pounds, 6'2", and he's beaten up a woman who's literally half his size. And once again, the question came to my mind, how could this be of God? How can it be that this represents the best that the designer of the universe has to offer? But his so-called discipline didn't end with our mother. My father was a strong believer in spare the rod, spoil the child. So at some point, I guess he decided that the bigger the rod, the less spoil the child. So he did away with his barber strap that he'd used when we were younger, and he took up a mattock handle, which is about a 4.5-foot piece of wood, the handle of a farming tool, and the base of it, where the metal piece slides on, is about 14, 15 inches in diameter. And he would swing that like it was a baseball bat when he was disciplining the kids. And one of the things that would happen was he would beat the child, give him 10 hits or whatever, and then he would yell and scream at them about what they were doing wrong and how it was connected to their internal soul. And while he's doing the yelling, the damage to the skin is taking place, and the skin swells and gets tender. And then he would go back to beating them, and swinging the mattock as hard as he was, it would split the skin, and this kind of clear reddish fluid would ooze out from the damaged area. And sometimes when the mattock wasn't available, or he was madder than other times, he would use his fists, he would use his feet. I remember there were plenty of times when he would grab the child by their hands, pull them towards him, and bring his knee up into their stomach repeatedly. He discovered early on that this had a remarkable capacity to restore order in his world. One of the things I didn't realize till years later is that the physical heals, but the verbal lives forever. So all these things are going on, and so much more throughout my childhood as he's presenting his version of the gospel to the world. As I grew, my doubts grew with me. As my doubts grew, my defiance grew, and you did not defy my father. So the violence that I experienced grew as well. I couldn't reconcile what I heard him say and what I saw him doing to others. Where he saw brute, defiant beasts, and this is how he described you. This is how he described the world, brute, defiant beasts. Where he saw brute, defiant beasts, I saw humans who were just trying to get by, trying to figure out the world, and making mistakes and learning from mistakes and growing. I remember I was about 12 years old and we were out selling candy on it was a winter day, I remember that, because it was cold out. And I was in this phase where I was really into Elton John. I thought his music was incredible. I had a tape recorder that I carried with my box of candy and was playing his music all the time. 8-track, not 8-track, cassette tape. And I remember going through this mental process, wondering how was it that someone who could produce such incredible music could have such profound positive impact on the world with the talent that he had. And the only thing that was going to matter to the creator of the universe was who he decided to have sex with. I didn't articulate it that well in my mind, but I remember having that thought, thinking this just doesn't make sense. When my father would ridicule and abuse strangers, I would blush with embarrassment, and he knew it. He knew that I didn't like what he was doing, and he hated that part of me, and he made it clear. I couldn't rise to that level of cruelty to other people. And so I became ashamed of that part of me. I felt shame and frustration that my nature didn't match his expectations. And it took me years before I realized that I even felt that way. So let me shift gears here for a minute, folks. I want to talk to you about something that I think is an important point to consider with all this. The vast majority of people who've heard my family's message and seen what they're doing, the vast majority of them respond with some form of, well, that's not my God. My God's a loving God, that kind of idea. And I get frustrated with that because there is no real world evidence to suggest that they're right about that. One fact that can't be disputed is that the beliefs held by the Westboro Baptist Church are actually well grounded in the words of the Bible. This book, that's generally interpreted as the words of a benevolent God, contain all the passages necessary to come to the conclusions that my father has arrived at. The reality is that about 200 years ago, this version, the kind of preaching that my father does today, was mainstream Christianity in America. Most pastors of that time would use a sermon of American theologian Jonathan Edwards entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" to support that idea. And the essence of that sermon can be summed up in this sentence from the sermon. It says, "There's nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God." So this is not some bizarre Branch Davidian, Waco, Texas crazy. This is out of the Bible. This is legitimate stuff, guys. When I hear people saying their God's nothing like the God of Westboro Baptist Church, I simply disagree. They just haven't read the passages. I was recently reading an interview by a philosopher, a woman from the University of Massachusetts. And she says it's the problem of evil is the biggest piece of evidence that she has for being certain that there is no such thing as a God. And one of the thoughts I had was, well, because she makes her case by saying that the problem of evil runs contrary to the idea of a benevolent God. But what about the problem of evil if God's not benevolent? And she doesn't seem to take that possibility into consideration. My father taught us that God doesn't change. He's always been as he is today. And for this reason, my father abhorred any evidence of change in the world and the message of God. As he watched religions evolve to meet the changing ideology of society, which it does today and has forever done, it evolves. Societies say that this now is a moral standard, and the leaders of religion move and shift their own ideas of the world, their own ideas of what passages in their holy books say to fit those ideas of society. My father saw this happening as it always has, and he saw it as a degradation of the truth. There is once and for all an absolute truth, and that cannot change. And if it changes, then that's evidence that God's not working in your heart. So if you think about that for a minute, folks, then now being stubbornly determined to adhere to a single idea of absolute truth becomes the evidence that you are the only people on earth who are in God's grace. So this is going on. I reach my teens. My older brother Mark meets a gal, and she ends up going to church for a couple of years. And then one day she comes in for the evening service, and my father's beating my older sister upstairs. Everybody's standing around in the church auditorium wringing their hands, and Lueva says to Mark, "Why isn't someone doing anything about this?" And Mark gets upset with her because she's not supposed to say that. And so she turns around and walks out and says, "I'm not coming back here. I'm not going to raise a family in this kind of environment." So she forced Mark to choose, and he chose her over God. My father went out and tried to get Mark to come back. He actually forced him back at one point. Mark turned around and left again. And my 16-year-old mind watching this thought, well, here's a novel idea. We can actually leave this environment. We actually have choices in our life. So I started considering that possibility, and over the next year and a half, started making plans. But I knew, because of what had happened to my older sister, that I couldn't dare let anybody else know that I planned on leaving, and I couldn't leave until I was 18. So I bought a car and hid it and slowly packed my meager belongings, and then on the night of my 18th birthday, I waited until everybody was asleep. It was about 10:30 at night. I went and got the car, backed it into the driveway, rolled up the garage door and packed the few boxes I had in the trunk. And then I slipped back inside the house, went into the living room of actually it would be the dining room of the house. We actually lived in the same building as the church. And so there was a set of stairs that went up to my father's room, right in the dining room. And I stood at the bottom of those stairs and I could see a clock over on the wall here above the 3 refrigerators. And then there was a door over here that opened out into the sanctuary, and I could see the pulpit that my father had preached behind all those years. And I was thinking about the various things that he had taught us and all the times that he had repeated the same verses over and over that justified his anger and his hatred of the world. And I remembered him being so adamant that his children weren't real followers of God, and they weren't really saved if they weren't willing to be as aggressive and as defiant and as angry as he was towards the sinners of the world. And I remember thinking that this was an incubator of hate. And I turned back and I looked at the clock and I watched it roll up to 12 o'clock. And I turned around and walked out of the house. Those who knew the truth about our childhood, and there were a few of them, they were aware of what was going on. And they would talk when they saw me, they would wonder how I was so normal because they knew how much violence that I had experienced. And I thought, at the time, well, that's silly. I'm fine, I'm gone. I'm free, I can live my life. And it wasn't until years later that I realized it was not normal to, every once in a while, I would just disappear. I would hide from the world and I would sit for hours and I would just rage quietly inside. If anybody tried to approach me during those times, I would just freak out. And I thought that was normal. Because one of the things that happens to us when we're growing up, folks, is normal is what we experience. We don't really have a grasp of the idea that other people are living a completely different life. They get a completely different set of ideas. So that was normal to me. In 1981, I moved to Southern California, met a young lady. We dated for 4 years, and I became a father to her 3-year-old daughter. And I was satisfied with that. Every time I thought about marriage, I thought about the fact that if I asked her to marry me, that I'd be condemning both of us to an eternity in hell, because she'd been married before. And so that would be adultery, and God doesn't put up with that. And then there was this inability. I tried to intellectualize the idea of love, and I couldn't get my mind around it. And she knew about that, and we talked about it a lot. And finally one day she comes to me and she'd read a book, and she wrote down on a 3x5 card these words: "Love is not a feeling by which we're overwhelmed, rather it's a committed, thoughtful decision." So I took that little card and I taped it up on the bathroom mirror, and I thought, I can do that. So I pushed the anxieties to the back of my mind and I asked her to marry me. And we got married in 1986. And about a month later, she came to me and told me she was pregnant. And I didn't have the nerve to tell her that this was going to end badly. Because when she told me she was pregnant, it was a foreign concept to me, because I believed with an absolute certainty that because I had left and turned my back on God, that he wasn't going to let me have any kids, because our Father taught us that having kids was a gift from God. So I was convinced that this was God's way to get back at me. So for 7 months I held my breath, couldn't tell anybody that that's what I was thinking. And then in June of 1987, when Tyler was born, it was probably the closest thing to a miracle, as I understand miracles, that ever happened in my life. And then 18 months later, my wife gave birth to a set of twins, and I started questioning the concept of miracles all over again. And soon after that, things began to unravel for me. My world shifted as I took on the labor of love of raising these 3 creatures. And I was determined that they would know love, and they would understand that they were involved, that they were included, that they were a part of the world. They would never doubt for a moment the unconditional acceptance of their Father. At the same time, I also began to ask questions without answers. One of the biggest problems I ran into, folks, was these emotions, these deep, what I would call, for an atheist, spiritual emotions that I felt for my kids. How can that be? And then the behavior that my father exhibited toward his children also be. So the natural answer is to think that there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with me, and that's why those kind of things were happening. So I found a counselor with a theology degree and a psychology degree, and we worked together for about a year, and I started unraveling the hypocrisy of my father's religion. And then I decided we were going to join a local evangelical free church. This was all part of that idea of having my children feel included, feel involved with the community. I thought that was important. And frankly, at that point, I thought, well, maybe there is something to this whole God thing, and maybe I have a chance, after all, because after all, God's a loving God. So I listened to the message of the kinder, gentler God of mainstream Christianity, and I started praying a lot. I prayed night and day for a sign that this God was there and that He cared. And His silence took me deeper into the theology. I became an outspoken apologist for Christianity by day. But at night I was constantly worrying and fretting about the whole question. Because once again, it came down to, well, whatever you decide about God, you're deciding it because you don't believe the truth, and Satan's fooling you. So, sleepless, anxious hours, nights passed as I played violent confrontations over in my mind with my father, where I tested some of these new ideas, challenged the ideas that I've been raised with. But my depression deepened, and I went back into counseling finally, and this time I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I was convinced by the counselor to check into a mental health facility. 2 weeks later, I left the mental health hospital, and I left believing that there was no way to avoid this stuff. The best thing I could do was just forget about it and ignore it. So I went back to church and Bible study. And then over the next 10 years, a handful of events kind of highlighted the journey that I was on. Seemed to be the moments where my processing finally coalesced, and I saw myself changing and moving in the direction of non-belief. One thing that I recall very vividly is when America was engulfed in that first Gulf War, and Saddam Hussein was lobbing those Scud missiles into Israel. I had images of Armageddon in my head. I was convinced this was the time. And it's important to understand, one of the reasons I was so sure about that, one of the reasons it caused such anxiety for me is because my father had taught that it was going to be around the year 2000 that Christ was going to return, give or take 12 years. So when I had left, actually, I left with the idea that I was going to eventually die and go to hell, and so I'm going to enjoy my life. And I had till the year 2000. So, and I would deal with that question later. So when it came in 1991, that was a bit disconcerting to me, because God was taking 9 years away. So, and then in 1994, it was Christmas time. I'm driving home. I had the kids with me, and we're going to stop at the Pizza Hut to get dinner. And Christmas carols were playing on the radio, and we're sitting outside the Pizza Hut, and Tyler asked me a question about Jesus. Who was Jesus? And I thought, okay, he's been going to church for a while. I have a different attitude about God. He's going to love this. So I turned the radio down, and I started talking to him about heaven, about the beauty of life after death. And he stopped me in the middle of my explanation, and he said, well, what about the people who don't believe? Now, this is a 7-year-old boy. Bless his little atheist heart. So I said, well, the people who don't believe, they have to go to a place called hell. Now, this wasn't the hell of my childhood, because I was, at that point, believed it meant that they were outside of the presence of God, and that was bad enough. And he said, well, And I said, they're in hell. And he says, well, for how long do they have to go to hell? And I said, for eternity. And he wanted to know how long eternity was. And I could tell at that point that things weren't going my way when he asked how long. And I said, well, eternity is forever. And Tyler started crying. And then Haley and Hunter sitting in the back seat started crying. So I gathered him up in my arms and I held him for a while, and I remembered that I was about that age when I was thinking about eternity and hell. So I stopped taking my kids to church, and I started teaching them to think critically. I challenged them constantly over the ideas that they brought home from school. They would say that such and such was true, and I'd say, well, how do you know that? Well, early on, it's because the teacher told them. And I broke them of that habit. Taught them to be skeptical, to ask questions. And in the midst of that whole process, there was a still small voice that kept reminding me, physician, heal thyself. So I started challenging the leaders of my church. I was asking questions. They started distancing themselves from me. And then September 11th happened. And America was shook to its foundations. And like all of us, I struggled with the powerful emotions elicited from that act of faith, blind faith. There was a young lady named Lisa Frost who had gone to school with my stepdaughter. She'd grown up there in the same community that we'd grown up in. And she had just graduated from Boston University and was on her way home to visit her family there in Rancho Santa Margarita, where we live. She was going to be there for a week, and then she was going up to the San Francisco Bay Area to start her new career. And her life ended in that second plane that hit the tower. So I reached out to the family, and I spent time with her father, who struggled desperately for justification and for an answer to how he lost this precious gift. And I watched as the country responded, and I had an epiphany. We collectively condemned an act of blind faith, then turned to blind faith for our answers. In 2004, for the first time in my life, I picked up a book on the question of God that wasn't written by a Christian. Now, that was a novel idea. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have today with believers and non-believers, is that we tend to kind of isolate ourselves with the ideas and focus on the evidence that supports our ideas. So I bought this book by Michael Shermer called The Science of Good and Evil, and everything changed for me. I remember running downstairs and yelling at my wife, look what he's writing. This is what I've been trying to tell you. And my wife looked scared, and I called my best friend, and she told me it was because I had been raised with a false idea of who God was. She's a very devout Christian. But for me, it was the first time in my life that I had concrete evidence that there were other people out there thinking the same way I was. And that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy. But they're just ideas until they're vetted by reality, and they will stand the test of evidence. They're just ideas until they can be proven true through experimentation and rigorous research. So I began to challenge the ideas that were literally hardwired in my brain at that point. What gives the Bible validity is the inspired word of a creator. What's the evidence for that? Lacking the evidence, what about all the ideas that flowed from that belief? What proof did I have that physical abuse is necessary to raise a child properly? What proof, independent of a supernatural law, ever justifies the idea that a certain group of people should be shunned and treated unequally because they love someone of the same gender? What evidence is out there? I spoke earlier of an epiphany after September 11th. It occurred to me in the emotional upheaval following that attack that the mechanism of blind faith could very well be one of the greatest threats that humans face today. It's an epistemology thing, folks. How do you know what you know? Let me put it to you this way. A fundamental attribute of faith is that it cannot be challenged. If I invoke faith as justification for a belief, I'm bound to allow that from all others. So by invoking faith for my beliefs, I now live in a world where I must accept, at some level, a man's argument that it's okay to fly planes into buildings, as long as he builds that idea on faith. The thing that protects people from dangerous ideas is the ability to challenge them with reason and logic. Faith takes that ability away. Accountability disappears, and literally anything goes. I remember there's a verse, I'm sure a lot of you have heard it, faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these is charity, or it's been translated now to love, faith, hope, and love. These are considered positive, motivating characteristics that we should all have and nurture in our lives. Faith and love are positive motivators, aren't they? 18-month-old Dean Heelman playing in his backyard, stepped on a sliver of glass and cut his foot. Love for their son motivated his parents to treat the wound and comfort the child. As the wound continued to bleed, love motivated them to reach out for help. Faith motivated them to reach out to their pastor for that help. Faith motivated them to choose the biblical words of James that prayer and anointing with oil was the prescribed treatment for their son's injury. Love motivated them to save their son, but faith motivated them to choose an unaccountable method. Little Dean never saw his second birthday because of faith. Faith lets people argue that if you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer, that you're evil. And there is no challenging that. Never mind what else you do in your life. As I mentioned earlier with Elton John. Never mind if you bring great joy and love and support to other people. If you're a member of that community, you're prejudged as evil, and reason can't dislodge this wrong idea from the faithful mind. Ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Let me challenge you with a new idea, a simple one. Faith is not a virtue. It can allow evil to flourish unchecked, and it's the justification for too much hatred. But religion isn't all bad, many will argue. Christians do a lot of good. Besides, my God's a God of love. He doesn't hate. Frankly, I don't care how one defines their personal idea of a God. I care about the doctrines that come from the religion they claim. Doctrines that harm humans. If you align with a particular God claim, you support their dogma, your ideas of God notwithstanding. I saw a sign. There's a Unitarian church in Calgary, and they'll put signs up on the side of the building, messages, and I was driving by there recently, and they had a sign up that said, every snowflake in an avalanche pleads not guilty. It's that idea that we find here, that with enough support, even bad ideas can do a lot of harm. Sam Harris talks about choices that increase the overall good in his book, The Moral Landscape. I imagine in my mind a great scale that's dipping oh so slowly towards our demise as we continue to debate whether it's just to be unjust to a certain group of people. We debate it as though we had the right to. The sheer audacity of that overwhelms me at times. Recently there was a story in the newspaper. There's a gal or a guy. He's the most popular drag queen in Ireland. His stage name is Miss Panty Bliss, but his given name is Rory O'Neill. But he's at an event, and he apparently caused quite a stir there in Ireland over this whole concept of homophobia. Because he called the wrong person a homophobe, and now they're calling that hate speech. So he gets up and he's talking to the people there at this event. And he tells them about being at a crosswalk, waiting to cross, and a car goes by. And they scream out the window at him, calling him a fag, and they threw something at him. He said it didn't really hurt what they threw at him. And he said, and I am a fag. He said, but it felt oppressive to him, like all the other jabs and insults that he endures in his life. And he talks about now that when he walks up to a crosswalk and is waiting to cross, he checks himself he kind of looks down. What is it about me that tells people that I'm gay? And he hates himself for doing that. Finds it oppressive. Listening to his talk, and you might want to do that if you can just Google Miss Panty Bliss. You get a real human glimpse of the burden that he and so many millions more carry around. How many of his resources, his personal resources that he has to use to advance his life, the same resources that he could use to improve society, and he has to spend it just trying to stay even, trying to stay normal. Tremendous waste of resources, not only there, but multiply that times a million. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, where we waste these resources, dealing with the unnecessary imposed burdens that we place on people. And the sheer audacity of it overwhelms me at times. My little adopted niece, my older brother Mark adopted two little girls, and they both were severely fetal alcohol syndrome babies. And I remember a lot of the problems that we had raising them were when I was over there. As they grew, they had a lot of physical and emotional issues that had to be dealt with. She had a string of counselors that she used that were specialists in this area. But I remember years later talking to Sarah, my oldest, the oldest of the two. And I remember her description, vivid description of the terrors and the images and the ideas that she had to fight off constantly just to feel normal, just to be normal. A tremendous amount of personal energy that she had to expend just to maintain equilibrium. And I thought how much further she could be in her life if not for that one mindless, selfish act of another human that condemned her to this condition for life. Annie Laurie Gaylor, a lot of you folks know her, Dan's wife. She's head of the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. She spoke at the Sexy Secular Conference a while back in Akron, and she read this poem called Religion's Child by Shirley. It goes like this: aware of light and yet condemned to grope, through dark regression's cave, told she must find life's purpose in that blackness without hope. Denied the luminescence of her mind, until at last she finds the darkness kind. Religion's child, a babe once bright and fair, curls up, tucks in her tail, and says her prayer. That's it, folks. That's what I'm trying to point out here. We do great damage to this precious resource of ours. How much further could we be as a society if these religiously imposed burdens didn't exist anymore? There's something better to defend, in my mind, an ideology that's sustainable. Humanism, equality, justice. An ideology based on reality. Imagine a society where there's no longer an issue about who one chooses to love and marry. Just imagine that for a minute. Imagine a world where a person's reproductive organs don't limit them. Imagine a paradigm shift in parenting where we let go of the ideas we have the right to impose our limitations on our children. A new way of thinking that we have a sacred duty to minimize the harm that we saddle these little ones with. Yes, we're changing the world in many ways, folks. This group is growing. These ideas are growing. But in Robert Frost's words, we have miles to go before we sleep. Not long ago, an 8-year-old Yemen girl died from the injuries she suffered on her wedding night at the hands of her 40-year-old husband. A 20-year-old transgender woman was deliberately targeted and beat to death by a group of young men in New York City. There are still 32 states in this country who deliberately discriminate based on a religious idea. And I could go on for hours with examples, folks. Religion set the stage, but we can do better. Several months ago, CFI's Geneva-based UN representative, Dr. Elizabeth O'Casey, addressed the UN Council of Human Rights, saying that culture and religion must never legitimize anachronistic practices that violate the core principles of equality, autonomy, and dignity upon which human rights are based. Let me close with one final thought. This is something that I remind myself of every morning. I actually had someone ask me recently why it was so important to me, and so I'll explain that. It's the idea of it being a moral question. And I had never thought of it this way before until I read this quote. Bertrand Russell was asked late in his life, he'd done an interview, and they said, well, what is it you would like to tell people about the life you've lived and the experiences you've had? He said, I'd like to say two things, one intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say is this. When you're studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you want to believe or by what you think would have beneficial social effect if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That's the intellectual thing I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say, I should say love is wise and hatred is foolish. Thank you all very much.
One of the things that I realize is that people who are extremely anti-gay are probably gay in the closet. So I just wanted to know that if you think your father might be gay. That's the all questions that I always had. That's the sorry.
One of the things that, when I started talking, one of the things I committed to was that I was going to try to be as honest as I could be about the experiences I grew up with and the ideas that I have. And at times that's very difficult because, first of all, you only have so much time to talk to someone. And it's such a big story, as is everyone's story. So, to that specific question, for those who didn't hear it, do I think that there's a possibility my father's gay because of this inclination we see in society for the most vitriolic rhetoric to come from people who actually have those tendencies or act on those tendencies in their own lives. And the only evidence that I have forces me to say that I don't know. There's nothing in the family stories that were told when we were growing up, and there's nothing in the actions that he engaged in when I was growing up around him that would speak to that question one way or another, other than what everyone sees.
Yeah, in regards to any of the abuse that ever happened, has any authorities ever been contacted? If so, like what happened? It just seems like it was so quiet. Like any authorities ever intervene at all?
Yeah. Actually, back in 1971, after my brother and I received a particularly vicious beating and we weren't able to suit up for gym, and this was one time in a succession of times, and so the school was aware of what was going on, and they finally acted that time, and they called the police, and the police came and picked my brother and I up from the school and took us down and took photos and brought charges against my father. The process itself was flawed, and you lived in an environment, back in 1970, there was still this tendency in America, well, today there's still this tendency in America to give a lot of deference to religion and to religious leaders. And in my opinion, the process failed the victims in that situation because they appointed an attorney, but the attorney could only question us in the presence of my father. After they had the evidence for the abuse, they returned us to our father. And eventually my father used, I wasn't there to hear the actual arguments in court, but eventually the court dropped the case. So.
One just quick follow-up to that, I guess, too, is after that happened, did you experience any more like abuse just from that occurrence?
Oh yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. The night of, we did.
Yeah.
Because it was our fault that he was in front of the authorities. And I understand that's commonplace also with abusers.
Hi. What I'm particularly curious about, I suppose I'm trying to say this in the most gentlest way possible, given the contribution to mental illness, it seems, growing up in an environment that one like yours would probably contribute to, how was your father not murdered in his sleep? Like, I am actually, you thought of this, given the amount of people who have left, obviously you yourself are quite level-headed and speak out vehemently against such practices that your father undertakes, but there are many members of the Westboro Baptist Church, and it's an honest question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I thought about it. I don't know how you don't think about it if, coming out of something like that, but I think one thing that speaks to that very clearly is the idea that we had of who he was in our lives, that he not only was our biological father, but he was a representative of the God of the universe, and he was a pastor, and he was, whatever he said was accurate and was true, and it wasn't to be questioned. So his justification for what he was doing was from the Bible, and what right would we have to be angry at him for doing what God told him to do? That's just a tiny piece of it.
I'm just wondering, what was your reaction to the Phelps versus Schneider case? As you know, it made international headlines. So I'm just wondering, were you upset about it, or do you think you agree with the Supreme Court ruling about it?
First of all, what most folks don't realize is the Supreme Court has never addressed the question of whether it's okay to protest at funerals. And that was one of the things that's frustrating to me about the reporting that came after that case. There were very specific elements, legal questions associated with that Schneider case. You hear in the legal circles that the worst thing you can do is take a bad case before the Supreme Court to get some broader principle adjudicated. And that's what you had there. There was a bad set of circumstances. The court deliberately, according to Scalia's minority opinion, deliberately avoided the question by saying that the material that they had written online wasn't in evidence, when in fact it was, because it was part of the lower court's decision. So, by making that statement, they were able to dodge the question altogether of whether the 40-some laws that exist right now in federal and state laws exist that limit protesting at funerals. They didn't answer that question. They simply answered the question for the Schneider case, and it has broadly been considered a victory for free speech, and it simply isn't. If you read the Roberts decision, he deliberately says we're not answering that question. It's right in the decision, so you can read it. So that's one thing I want to say about that. The other thing I want to say is that I see it personally as not a question of free speech, but a question of competing rights. Because even though it's not enshrined in the Constitution, we have lived throughout human existence with the de facto right of burying our loved ones in peace. That is just an accepted reality in the lives of humans. So I don't see it as having any kind of, producing any kind of threat to the robust nature of free speech in America. Simply say that in this situation, in these circumstances, your free speech is temporarily limited. If you need to say this stuff that you want to say, go over here and say it. You can't say it here, and you can't at these particular times. I don't have any trouble with that, because we already have those kind of limitations on free speech.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm thinking of the longevity of Westboro community. It says that your father's quite ill. Is there anybody that you're aware of that would step up to the plate, that's the right gender, because obviously it needs to be male, take over the parish and continue the work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. A lot of folks don't realize, a lot of people understand that Shirley is the kind of de facto leader of this God Hates Fags campaign that they engage in. But she cannot be the leader. You're absolutely right about that. One of the reasons that came up in my conversation with the reporter, that one of the pieces of evidence that he has that my father's not well is that he's no longer producing sermons on the website. And apparently, I don't know this 100% to be true, but it's my younger brother Tim and Steve Drain, who you guys probably all remember from the video. They're the ones doing the sermons right now. If I were to guess at this point, I would say Tim would be the one that's going to at least be the official leader of the church or when my father passes.
Hi. I've heard it suggested that your father and his cult are sort of operate in such a way that they use opportunities for First Amendment lawsuits to profit. Do you think there's any sort of merit to that sort of suggestion motivation?
No, I think they use the law to keep themselves protected. I think that they will promote that idea because when, in the Schneider case, when the appellate court ruled against the lower court decision, they also said that Schneider had to pay $16,000 and some for attorney's fees for the other side. And it was a big uproar, and in fact, I think it was who's the guy on Fox News, Bill O'Reilly, ended up paying those attorney's fees. And my sister made a point of getting up on the media and saying that they were going to use that to continue their protest. So it will sustain that notion that exists out there. But the reality is they're spending, in their crime, they were spending $300,000 a year doing that. They're not getting anywhere near that kind of money from lawsuits. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Air Hug. I just want to know, what did you do in your free time when you were a teenager? If you had free time, spare time, what did you do? What were your hobbies? What did you like to do?
Well, when I was younger, I remember we played a lot of, we had enough kids that we played a lot of football and a lot of baseball. We spent a lot of time together as children, partially out of necessity.
So football was okay.
Football was okay, yeah. And we did a lot of singing, surprise, surprise. They've carried on that tradition with their campaign. I was into theater when I was in high school and junior high, and I played some football in junior high as well. But between the candy sales and the running campaign program that we were on and school, it was a limited amount of free time once we got up into our school years.
You said theater, that's interesting to me. That was okay too, because that's usually typically associated.
Yeah, no, this was school, so.
Thank you.
You didn't seem to have an opinion about that. That's interesting.
I have two questions. The first one is, you talked about predestination and that they already accept that a majority of the people are destined to go to hell. Well, then why do they protest funerals and such things when they already know that they're predestined? Well, why can't you just leave them alone and let them be and let them go to hell eventually? Why do you gotta make a big statement about it?
Because sometimes religion isn't rational. It's a very good point because my sister Shirley, her Twitter feed, she changed. It's still WVC Shirley, but I guess you can change the name. It shows up with it. So now it says no repent, no forgive. That's her name. So I tweeted her the other day and said that's kind of hypocritical because you also preach no choice, and that's the point. But
having that belief just also seems pointless to do the protest.
But remember what I said in my talk, that because they believe God makes the decision, that there really is no, it isn't like God shows up at your door, knocks on and says, here, here's a free ticket to heaven, right? So you don't really know whether you have it. So you're looking at behavior, and that's what that church does. I said that they're going to parse everything that was said in the movie or in the show. they do that, and they're looking constantly for evidence that something you do or think or say is contrary to what the Bible teaches. And so that whole issue of whether you're consistent with the Bible is profoundly important to them. And one of the components that is part of their dogma is this idea that they're supposed to go out and preach the Word of God. Never mind what it produces as far as fruit. So that's the answer. The question is, it doesn't matter whether or not we save anybody. It doesn't matter whether or not what God has decided. God told us to preach, and then He's going to bring it to fruition to the extent He wants to.
Thank you. And my second question is the question about whether a benevolent God would exist, considering that the existence of evil. I don't see how there really could be a benevolent God, an all-loving and all-caring God, especially an all-powerful God, simply because there is the existence of evil. You refer to Epicurus's riddle, where from whence cometh evil. I think that pretty much makes the point in a solid, kind of way.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But what if He isn't a benevolent God?
Right, but then you would say, well, if He's neither willing nor able, then why call Him God?
That's a human perspective. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that's the answer they would get. You're thinking like a human. One of my father's favorite quotes. Yeah, figure that out. One of my father's favorite quotes was when Martin Luther, one of his adversaries in his time was Erasmus, and one of his responses to something that Erasmus wrote was, "Your thoughts of God are too human." And that always puzzled me. So, well, what the hell else thoughts are we going to have as humans, right? So, it's a good point.
I guess one of the more rare and remarkable transitions from an area of almost shunning any thinking, critical thinking at all, to going to some critical thinking, but still being an apologist, to being an atheist. Having done that, how do you feel like you have a different approach when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody like, the members of your family that are still where you started? Do you find there's a more effective way that most of us might not be privy to?
First of all, I'd say I'm a work in progress. I still do a lot of things that, looking back on it, I probably shouldn't have done that. So it's a lifetime learning process, number one. Number two, the one thing that I have said all along is that I will not reach out to anybody who's still in that situation, because I'm firmly convinced that they have to find the reason on their own. It has to come from them first. The crack or whatever Megan talks about, she started asking questions and she got into a texting conversation back and forth with a Jewish man, and eventually convinced them that there was something wrong. So I will make myself available only after they've made a decision to leave that.
So do you think there's value in even trying to have a sort of conversation with somebody like your father? Or?
Yeah, no, I don't. It's funny you say that, because when I was growing up, when I was out in California, before they became known, and I would have conversations with people, and oftentimes they would turn it back on me, and it was my fault that I didn't have a relationship with my father. And it got to the point where it was just impossible for me to convey the words properly so that people could understand. It's not going to happen. You know these certain things we know. I know my father. He's not going to change his mind. It just isn't going to happen. And I have to believe that if my siblings are there, have been there as long as they have, there's nothing I'm going to say or do that's going to change their mind.
Okay, so just last quick follow-up. You mentioned that you tweeted at your sister recently. Have you had any backlash or ongoing relationship? How are you with those who are still in the church now?
Yeah, well, we don't have a relationship. They're not allowed to. But every once in a while we'll have a confrontation and they'll challenge something I said. But it doesn't get anywhere. It's just a rhetorical battle.
Thank you very much.
This might be a bit personal, but do you think there's a chance for you to have a deathbed conversion?
Me?
Yes.
Is anything possible? But, well, that's not a fair answer. I'm satisfied with where I am as far as my idea of God.
Just because I know that you mentioned even when you were struggling, it was always in the back of your head, right? You said, I was just curious as to.
Yeah, well, there's still a lot of stuff. This is interesting. One of the interesting things about this, I still find myself, something will bother me and I'll be thinking about it and I realize that there's still a piece of an idea that I still adhere to that I hadn't let go of yet. Right? But a lot of the stuff I've let go of now. No, but it's a process. I still will go through these periods where there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear will crop up. But now I have the knowledge to talk myself out of it.
Because I know when I was first studying my faith, I was always scared that last seconds I would just be like, oh, God save me, but do you think that would happen? How often?
I hope this speaks to your question. We had a speaker in Calgary with CFI. He is a physician who spent 20-some years as working with people who are dying. I forget the term. And he came and gave a talk to the CFI. And his personal experience, you're not supposed to use personal experience, but his experience is that it isn't the ones who believe in God who die well. And it isn't the ones who don't believe in God who die well. It's the ones who hold their belief most firmly, no matter what they believe. The ones who are confident with whatever they believe, who leave peacefully. I thought that was very interesting. So if that's true, then I don't think I will.
Good.
First of all, I want to thank you just for doing what you're doing. I find it extremely commendable, and I think you're very brave for what you did. But I wanted to ask you, any of the family members that you have left, are they also a part of sharing their stories with people? Or do they support you in what you're doing? Do you still keep contact with them, or are they still more on the side of not really understanding fully like what your goal is?
Yeah. My older brother Mark, who was the reason I left, the justification, I guess. He and I worked together for like 25 years in the printing business. We still have a good relationship. He is a mainstream Christian now, and we don't talk about it. It just seems like it's not a good idea to open that can of worms. But Mark has written, he actually changed his last name, so he prefers to stay behind the scenes somewhat, but he will talk about it and has talked about it before. Dorotha, who's the only other one that left and stayed gone, my younger sister, and she is I'm not sure what she is, some obscure version of belief in Christ. But she's very private about it. In general, it's not.
Thank you.
Hi, Nate.
Oh, hi.
I have two quick questions that have been on my mind. When a community is anticipating the arrival of Westboro Baptist Church, what do you think is most effective response?
Did you see what they did in Columbia, Missouri?
No, I didn't.
You guys remember that football player? From
The motorcycle gang showed up?
Yeah, they showed up to protest there, and they had a wall of kids just went on forever. That was incredible. That to me is the best response, is to take that opportunity to show support and community against those ideas that they're putting out there. This was several years back. They protested at a Jewish community center somewhere in Texas, and someone got the bright idea of collecting money based on how many minutes they were there. And they raised enough money, they were able to buy an ice making machine for the community center. So they put a plaque on it, and it says something like the Fred Phelps Memorial Hell Froze Over. So those are the ways to deal with don't try to challenge them on their ideas, because it's not gonna change anything. You just upset yourself.
That's kind of my second question was, when you're out there protesting or your siblings, did they ever come home and say, you know, someone said something to me today that really impacted me, or is it just basically a wall? Like, nothing's affecting me when you hear these. People go to the protest with their best arguments, right? And how does that affect any members?
Well, bear in mind, I never protested, but the experiences we had, because this kind of stuff was going on all the time we were growing up, there was very little, from my recollection, there was very little discussion one-on-one between the children about what we believed, what our father was teaching. Again, in large part, especially at those younger ages, well, I can only speak for myself, it didn't occur to me to assume that he was wrong. The ideas would come through my mind, but I mean, he had all the power there. He had the age, he had the experience, he had the knowledge. It wasn't questioned, so there were no conversations like that.
So I guess we have 2 more questions, and then we'll finish up.
Okay, come on.
The last time we shared a similar space was about 2 years ago at the Reason Rally. You probably remember that very well.
Yeah.
I think by all accounts, one of the speeches out of the few dozen or so that went on, one of the more impactful speeches was yours. It was a very moving talk that you did on the Washington National Mall. Also there was Michael Shermer. Just sort of remembering your talk now, and you got excited when you were talking about the book by Michael Shermer, and you wrote this skepticism from that, those words resonating. What was it like meeting Michael Shermer for the first time, and what did you talk about?
Actually, I didn't get to meet him there, but we've actually had him up in Calgary. So I had an opportunity actually to talk to him for quite a while. And I don't know, by the time I met him, I'd been doing a lot of talking for a while, so it wasn't, the hero worshiping had kind of torn out a little bit, but I was still a little bit nervous. He's a pretty bright fella.
Yeah.
But we had a very good conversation. We just talked about some of the stuff that he's written in his. Actually, one of the things we did talk about was he wrote a book called Why People Believe Weird Things. You read that? And the second or third printing of it, he actually added an 8th chapter because he'd been getting a lot of questions from people about, well, what about the fact that there's a lot of really, really smart people out there who fall sway to weird ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so he wrote this extra chapter called Why Smart People Believe Weird Things. And so we talked about that. The upstart of that, his argument is that none of us are immune to bad ideas. It's just whether or not we're willing to see where our feelings are in the process, because most beliefs are built on a series of assumptions, and somewhere in there there's a bad assumption or a bad rationale for using that assumption to draw a certain conclusion, right? And people stop reasoning. There's a lot of evidence out there, in fact. Again, I think it was Sherman who's done a lot of writing about this. And Sam Harris wrote about it in his book, Free Will. A lot of evidence that we really don't have as much free will as we might think we do. A lot of scientific evidence for that, right? So that points to the idea that really, we may think we're being rational, but we're kind of making the same mistakes everyone else is. So.
Just wanted to know too, if when's the first time you used the word atheist to
that's a good question. I got to be honest with you, there are times when I'm still nervous about using it. It has such profound implications to me. That my first talk I ever gave was at the American Atheist Conference in 2009, and it was unnerving to actually present myself as being aligned with him, because everything evil centers in an atheist and the ideology I grew up with.
I'm writing my master's thesis on that now, about atheist discrimination, prejudice, and why why we receive so much prejudice, and saying the A word out loud can be a very difficult thing for people to even endure.
I marvel every day when I read, all the papers I read and the articles I read, how much it has changed, how much the perception has changed. But it doesn't necessarily change with the devout religious people. There's still a lot of people out there that hear that. And the assumption immediately goes to immoral, dangerous. It's pretty profound.
Thank you for not keeping it private. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
I was just curious about what extent you think your father believes his rhetoric, and what extent maybe he's being motivated by some cruelty or sadism.
I don't know if I ever answer that accurately, because it's hard for me to discern what flows from what with him, because they all seem to be so interconnected. Again, the stories that I heard, a reporter back in early 90s came out and he interviewed my family for a long time, and then he came out to California and interviewed Mark and I, and he wrote a book called Addicted to Hate. When the Topeka paper saw what he had, they said, this isn't going to be published. They fired him. He sued them, and for about 4 hours on that Monday morning, that document was public record until the Stratford publication got it quashed. But it was part of the lawsuit, so it got out and it got on the internet, but it's in really bad form. And he did a lot of research back in Meridian, Mississippi, where my father grew up. And there's some evidence there that I had never heard before. But folks that grew up with my father said that there was evidence even when he was a young child that he got pleasure out of making people angry and then just kind of clinically observing their response to his behavior. So that suggests to me that cruelty component was there from early on. But I also believe firmly that my father truly believes what he preaches. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you for coming tonight to speak to our group. We really appreciate you coming all the way from Calgary to see us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So for the Windsor Atheist group, come on up for a group photo if you're interested. And on your way out, for everyone else, come on by and say hi to the members at the table over there. All right, thanks again.